Had just pulled my coat off the hook by the front door when my phone rang. It was my son-in-law. Just wanted to make sure you're still coming to the attorney's office this morning, Vincent said. His voice was smooth. It was always smooth. 10 o'clock. Don't be late, Lorraine. Don't be late. Not see you there, not do you need a ride. Just don't be late, like I was an employee. Like I was someone who needed managing. I told him I'd be there. I hung up, and I stood in my hallway for a moment, looking at the photograph on the wall. Gerald, at 52, laughing at something I'd said at our anniversary dinner, his eyes crinkled at the corners the way they always did when he really meant it. 4 months. It had only been 4 months since I'd buried my husband of 38 years, and already I felt like a stranger in my own life. I picked up my purse and walked out to my car. That's when I heard her. Mom, 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 wait, don't get in that car. She was standing at the edge of my driveway, 82 years old if she was a day, wearing a housecoat and slippers in 40-degree weather, her white hair loose around her shoulders. My neighbor, Rose. Everyone on Caldwell Street knew Rose. Everyone on Caldwell Street knew Rose. Everyone also thought Rose hadn't been quite right since her husband passed 6 years ago. She wondered sometimes. She repeated herself. She'd once called the police because she was convinced someone was stealing her roses, and it turned out she'd pruned them herself the night before and forgotten. I almost kept walking. Rose, I said gently, I have to be somewhere. Are you cold? Do you want me to call your daughter? I saw him, she said. She grabbed my arm with both hands, and her grip was stronger than I expected. Last night, in your driveway. The tall one with the dark hair. Your daughter's husband. I went still. He was under your car, she said. I couldn't sleep. I was sitting by my window and I saw his car, and I saw him get out, and he had a flashlight, and he was under your car for a long time. I watched him. I wrote it down. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her housecoat pocket and pressed it into my hand. A time, a description, her handwriting shaky but deliberate. 1014 a.m. Black car. Vincent, under Lorraine's car. Flashlight. Long time. My mouth went dry. I didn't get in the car. I went back inside, sat down at my kitchen table, and called a mechanic I trusted, a man named Earl who had serviced Gerald's trucks for 20 years. I told him I needed someone to come look at my car before I drove it anywhere. I told him it was urgent. He didn't ask questions. He was there within the hour. He found it in 11 minutes, the brake line. Not fully cut. That would have been too obvious, too fast. Just weakened. Scored in a way that would hold through neighborhood streets and then fail at highway speed when the pressure built, when there was nowhere to go. I sat on my front porch steps while Earl called the police, and I thought about the meeting I was supposed to be at right now. I thought about Vincent's voice on the phone that morning. Don't be late, Lorraine. He hadn't been worried I'd miss it. He'd been checking whether I was still alive. Let me go back. Because you need to understand who Vincent is and how he got here and how I didn't see it. Or maybe I did see it, and I just didn't want to believe that my daughter had married a man like this. Sophie was 31 when she brought him home for Thanksgiving. Gerald and I had the house on Caldwell Street then. The one we bought when Sophie was 3 full bedrooms, a big backyard, the kind of house that was worth significantly more than what we'd paid for it in 1987. Gerald had done well. He'd built a commercial refrigeration business from nothing, and by the time he was 60, he'd sold it for enough that we were comfortable, not extravagant, comfortable. A paid-off house, solid savings, a modest investment portfolio, and a lake property up in New Hampshire that had been in Gerald's family for 2 generations. Vincent knew all of this within the first hour of meeting us. I remember watching him that Thanksgiving, the way his eyes moved around our living room, not admiring it, appraising it. There's a difference. He complimented the house in a way that felt like calculation, mentioning square footage, noting the neighborhood's appreciation rates, asking Gerald offhand questions about whether we'd ever considered downsizing. Gerald laughed it off. Gerald always saw the best in people. It was one of the things I loved most about him, and one of the things that worried me most. Sophie was luminous that day. She'd met Vincent at the law firm where she worked as a paralegal. He was a junior partner, confident and polished and funny in the way that men who've practiced being charming are funny. She looked at him like he'd solved something for her. I smiled and passed the cranberry sauce and told myself I was being unfair. They were married 14 months later. a beautiful wedding at a vineyard in the Berkshires. I danced with Gerald until my feet hurt. I told myself the uneasy feeling in my chest was just mother of the bride anxiety. I was wrong. The changes started small. Sophie stopped coming to Sunday dinners alone. Vincent always had to come too, which meant the dynamic shifted because Vincent was the kind of man who required an audience for his opinions. Then she stopped correcting him when he spoke for her. Then, somewhere in the second year of their marriage, she stopped disagreeing with him at all, at least in front of us. Gerald noticed before I did. He said to me one night, "Something's off with our girl." I told him he was imagining things. 2 years into the marriage, Vincent started helping Gerald with his finances. It was presented as a kindness. Gerald's accountant had retired. Vincent had connections. He knew people who handled estates and investment portfolios. Why pay a stranger when family could help? Gerald was 70 by then, and the paperwork had always stressed him out, and Vincent was persuasive. I said I wasn't comfortable with it. Gerald said I was being stubborn. I should have fought harder. I didn't understand what Vincent was doing, not fully, until Gerald got sick. Gerald was diagnosed with a cardiac condition in January of last year. He spent 3 weeks in the hospital. Vincent came to visit twice. I was there every day, every single day, sleeping in that recliner they put in the corner of the room, eating vending machine sandwiches, holding my husband's hand while the machines beeped around us. And during those 3 weeks, while I sat beside my husband, Vincent was at our house. He told Sophie he was handling things. He was handling things all right. Gerald came home in February. He died in April. A second cardiac event, the doctor said. Peaceful, they said. He was at home, in his own bed, and I was beside him, and it was as close to a good death as death can be. I held him until he went still, and then I sat there for a long time before I called anyone. The funeral was on a Tuesday. It was the longest day of my life. And then, 11 days later, came the will reading. I had expected a formality. Gerald and I had done our estate planning years ago. Everything split equally. The house to me, the lake property to be handled according to a trust we'd set up together, Sophie as secondary beneficiary. Simple, clean. Gerald had been meticulous about these things. I sat across from Vincent and Sophie in the attorney's office, and I watched the lawyer open the folder, and I watched his expression change in a way that made my stomach drop. The will had been amended 7 months before Gerald died, while he was managing his medications and his shortness of breath and his twice-weekly cardiac rehab appointments. He had apparently signed a new document. The lake property transferred to a trust controlled by Vincent. The investment accounts restructured. My name was still on the house. I was still provided for. But the shape of what Gerald had built, the careful architecture of 38 years of work and saving and planning, had been quietly, methodically dismantled. I looked at my daughter across that table. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Gerald signed these himself, Vincent said. His voice was patient. Explanatory, the voice he used when he thought he was the smartest person in the room. He wanted to make sure everything was protected. You know how he worried. My husband, I said carefully, would never have done this without telling me. He didn't want to upset you, given your anxiety. I don't have anxiety. I have never had anxiety. Gerald knew that. Gerald would have known that. I drove home in silence. I sat in my kitchen for an hour. And then I called my own attorney, a woman named Patricia, who I'd found independently, whose name Vincent had never heard, whose number was not in any phone or email that Vincent could access. I called Patricia and I told her everything, and she said, "Don't touch anything, don't sign anything, and start writing down everything you remember." I wrote for 4 hours that night. I wrote down every conversation I could recall about finances. Every time Vincent had mentioned the will, every document I remembered Gerald mentioning. I wrote down the dates Gerald had been sick, the dates Vincent had been at our house, handling things, the dates that the amended documents had apparently been signed. And the more I wrote, the clearer it became. Gerald had signed those documents during a period when his cardiac medication had been recently adjusted, when he was tired and trusting and in pain. When he had believed, because Vincent had told him, that it was routine paperwork. Protective restructuring. Nothing to worry about. Don't bother Lorraine, she gets overwhelmed. My husband had been manipulated, and I was going to prove it. Patricia moved quickly. She subpoenaed the financial records. She contacted the witnesses who had signed the amended will. One of them, it turned out, was a notary public who shared office space with Vincent's firm. She found a pattern. It took 6 weeks. and it cost me more in legal fees than I'd spent on anything since the house itself. But Patricia found the thread, and she pulled it. During those 6 weeks, I kept my face neutral. I had Sunday dinner with Sophie and Vincent, and I passed the roast chicken, and I listened to Vincent talk about a property he was thinking of purchasing in Vermont, and I smiled at the right moments. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. Harder than watching Gerald in that hospital bed, because at least then I knew who the enemy was. I also started paying attention to things I'd ignored before. The way Vincent always positioned himself between me and Sophie in conversation. The way Sophie flinched slightly when he interrupted her. The way she'd stopped calling me just to talk. Every call now had Vincent in the background somewhere, or was cut short for reasons she couldn't quite articulate. I thought about what I knew of men like Vincent. I'd read enough, talked to enough women over 60 years of living to recognize the architecture of control when I finally let myself see it. He hadn't just stolen from me. He was stealing her. That's what made me most afraid. Then came the night Rose saw him under my car. When the police came that morning, the morning I was supposed to be at the attorney's office, I gave them Rose's note. I gave them Earl's report. I gave them everything Patricia had compiled over 6 weeks. Detective Harris, who took my statement, was a young woman with a very calm face and the habit of writing everything down before she responded to anything. I liked her immediately. "Your son-in-law is an attorney," she said. It wasn't a question. "He is," I said. "This is going to take some time to build correctly," she said. "I want to make sure we do it right." "Take whatever time you need," I said. "I'm not going anywhere." They arrested Vincent 4 weeks later. Tampering with a vehicle, financial elder abuse, a charge under Massachusetts law that Patricia had been building the documentation for since that first phone call, forgery. The notary lost her license within the month. The amended will was invalidated. Sophie called me the night of his arrest. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. She kept saying she hadn't known. She kept saying she was sorry. I believed her about the car. I don't think she knew about that, about the financial manipulation, about the way he'd slowly turned her against her own instincts, against her own mother. I think she'd known something was wrong for a long time and had been too afraid and too ashamed and too isolated to name it. I didn't say any of that on the phone. I just said, "Come home." She came home. She's been sleeping in her old room for 3 months now. We're figuring out the rest slowly. Some days are harder than others. Some days she's angry at him, at herself, at me for not intervening sooner, even though I tried. We're working through it. We have a good therapist. We have time. Rose testified at the preliminary hearing. She wore her good blue dress and she brought her piece of paper and she told exactly what she'd seen, in exactly the order she'd seen it, without embellishment or confusion. The defense attorney tried to suggest she was unreliable. Detective Harris had anticipated this. She had obtained the security footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera, footage that showed, at 1014 a.m., a dark-colored car parked in front of my house, footage that showed a figure in dark clothing lying on the ground beside my car with a flashlight. Rose looked at that attorney across the courtroom and she said, "I may be old, I may forget what I had for breakfast, but I remember that night perfectly because I knew something was wrong and I wrote it down." The courtroom was very quiet. After the hearing, I took Rose to lunch at a restaurant she'd been wanting to try, a little Italian place on Commercial Street that she'd mentioned 3 or 4 times over the years. We had pasta and cannoli, and she told me about her husband, Frank, who had driven a produce truck and made her laugh every single day for 41 years. I told her about Gerald. We sat there for almost 3 hours. I had been thinking for weeks about what to do for Rose. The obvious thing was money, but Rose's daughter had told me that Rose was comfortable. Frank had left her well provided for. What Rose needed, what I came to understand over those 3 hours at lunch, was the thing she'd been losing without anyone noticing, the sense that she was still sharp, still capable, still someone whose perceptions mattered. So I called a friend who runs a community center in our town, and I asked if they had any volunteer positions that involved welcoming new members, orienting them to programs, helping people feel at home. They had exactly that. I brought Rose there on a Wednesday morning and introduced her to the director, and I watched Rose's posture change the moment she realized she had somewhere to be, something to contribute, someone counting on her. She's there every Wednesday and Friday now. She's made 3 friends. Last week, she brought me a cutting from one of her rose bushes. She said she wanted me to have it because the roses were going to be beautiful this spring and I deserved something beautiful. I planted it under the kitchen window, where I can see it from the sink. Vincent's sentencing is in 6 weeks. Patricia tells me the financial elder abuse charge alone carries up to 5 years in Massachusetts. With the vehicle tampering and the forgery, the prosecution is asking for 8. I don't know what the judge will give him. I'd stop trying to control things I can't control. What I know is this. The lake property is back in the trust Gerald intended. The investment accounts have been restored. The house is mine. Everything Gerald built, everything he wanted for us is intact, and Sophie is sleeping down the hall. Some nights I hear her moving around in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, the way she used to do when she was a teenager and couldn't sleep. And I come down and I make us both tea, and we sit at the kitchen table, and sometimes we talk, and sometimes we talk. Last week she said, "Mom, I don't know how you stayed so calm through all of it." I thought about that for a moment. I said, I wasn't calm. I was just very clear about what I was doing. I was doing what Gerald would have done. I was being methodical, patient, precise. I was trusting the process and the people I'd chosen carefully and the neighbor who nobody believed, who turned out to be the most important witness of my life. Gerald used to say that the people everyone overlooks are often the ones paying the closest attention. He was right about that. He was right about most things. I just wish I'd had more time to tell him so. I keep the rosebush cutting by the kitchen window, and in the mornings, when the light comes in, sideways, and I'm standing at the sink with my coffee, I can see it. It hasn't bloomed yet. But it will. That's enough for now. People ask me sometimes how I stayed composed through all of it. I never have a clean answer. The truth is that composure isn't really the right word for what I was doing. I was frightened every single day. I was grieving my husband, and at the same time quietly dismantling the trap that someone had built around me. And those two things happening at once is not something you stay composed through. You just keep moving. You move because stopping feels like surrender. What I've come to understand, not as a philosophy, just as something I lived through and came out the other side of, is that the choices people make accumulate. Every small decision stacks on top of the last one. Vincent didn't wake up one morning and decide to forge a will and tamper with a brake line. He made 100 smaller choices first. To appraise instead of admire. To maneuver instead of connect. To see my husband's trust as a resource to be extracted rather than a gift to be honored. Each of those choices made the next one easier. That's how people like Vincent are built. Not all at once, but incrementally, one compromise at a time, until the thing they've become would be unrecognizable to whoever they started out as. I think about that when I think about Sophie. She didn't choose badly once. She was worn down slowly, so gradually, that she couldn't see the shape of it from inside. That's not weakness. That's what sustained manipulation does to a person. The intelligence was always there. She's one of the sharpest people I know. But intelligence alone doesn't protect you when someone has made it their full-time occupation to make you doubt what you're seeing. What protects you is staying connected to people who knew you before. Which is why the isolation was the first thing Vincent worked on. It always is with people like him. And Rose. I think about Rose most of all. Here was a woman whom the entire neighborhood had quietly written off. Too old, too forgetful, not quite reliable anymore. And she was the one paying attention at 1014 in the morning. She was the one who knew something was wrong before she could fully articulate why. She was the one who wrote it down, carefully, in her shaky handwriting, because she trusted her own perception even when no one else did. There's something in that I keep turning over. The people we overlook are often the ones who see the most clearly, precisely because no one is performing for them. Vincent never thought about Rose. She wasn't part of his calculation. And that oversight, that arrogance, is what undid him entirely. What I want to say, if this story means anything beyond itself, is this. Pay attention to what you actually see, not what you are told to see. Trust the neighbor. Everyone calls crazy. Trust the feeling in your chest that something is wrong, even when someone smooth and confident is explaining why you're mistaken. Build your life around people who knew you when, and stay close to them. Even when it's inconvenient, even when someone is working hard to make you forget why they matter. And if someone ever tries to make you feel foolish for noticing, write it down, date it, keep it somewhere safe. Rose did. and it saved my life.